Hey guys, AlphaXXO here. So, Total Drama, huh? If you don't know what Total Drama is, it's an animated reality show that has had 6 seasons, 2 spin-offs and a reboot, and overall was really good, with there only being 2 real bad seasons of the show, those being Season 6, Pahkitew Island, and the subject of this video, Season 5, All Stars. If you're unaware, Total Drama All Stars is a season where they got 14 of the best contestants up to that point and pinned them against each other. And this sounds like a great idea. And it is. But the way they executed it was not. The writers for this season clearly didn't understand the characters up to this point, and they only wanted to tell one specific story, leaving all the characters outside of that story to suffer the consequences. This season had so many problems. I'm here today to tell you how I would have handled it if I was making the show. Okay, so first thing about the show is the cast size and the episode count. Now, obviously these things didn't help, but based on the brand new reboot being really good, it's obvious that a smaller cast can still work. So I won't be changing that, and we'll stick with 14 contestants and 13 episodes. The thing is, the cast and the characters they chose are great, honestly, and it makes sense for all of them to make All-Stars. But with a small cast, it did mean that some very popular and important characters got cut, like Owen, Harold, and Beth, to name some. But honestly, it feels like they all already had their moments, with Harold and Beth peaking in action, and Owen later going on to be in the Redonkulous race. So, that's it, right? I have no issues with the cast. Well, yes and no. I like the cast they chose, but I'm going to replace 2 of the contestants for my version of the show. The first, to no one's surprise, is Sam. I like Sam, I do, but Sam is the only All-Star to never make merge, and had barely any chemistry with the rest of the cast, because he was only on a team with Scott and Lightning, and those 2 got put on the opposite team as him this time. So, I'm swapping him for Brick, who has had way more chemistry with the Revenge of the Island cast, having interactions with all the heroes and the villains, and outranking Sam in Revenge of the Island. The second contestant I am replacing is Sierra. Now, Sierra did rank very high in World Tour, getting 4th, and she also could work as an All-Star. But without Cody, she doesn't have much going for her. She could use her massive knowledge of the competition to strategize, but it's clear that Sierra is not that kind of character, even when the writers want to make you believe she is. I'm going to replace Sierra with Lashana. I have no reason to pick Lashana specifically. You could replace her with any first-gen female character in my version of All-Stars to work. I just chose her because it would give some much-needed conflict on the heroes team. Now we got our cast together and the hero and villain teams work fine. Now we just need to get into the actual episodes. Episode 1 is basically the same. I have no big issues with it, and Lindsay can still be the first out. The only thing I would change is how Lindsay is handled. It's very obvious to me that All-Stars writers don't understand the Gen 1 cast, and that can be seen here with Lindsay, with the fact that they dumbed her down heavily. And a big thing that makes it obvious they don't get these characters is that Lindsay had a small conversation with Heather at the start of the episode, and it was nice despite the fact that Lindsay and Heather have not been on good terms and have barely interacted together since season 1. My changes are Lindsay is still made to push by Courtney, but instead of forgetting how to push, because what the hell is that? Lindsay stands up for herself and doesn't let Courtney tell her what to do like Heather used to. She still gets eliminated, but she doesn't vote for herself and leaves with her dignity. Episode 2 is the same also. Lightning still leaves because of Joe, and Brick goes to Boney Island instead of Sam. The only change I have is Alejandro stops doing the hand walking, because why would he do that? Like, it gained him nothing in the actual season. And yes, the Mal arc starts in this episode, but don't worry, I have a plan for that. Episode 3 is where I start to change things a lot more. the villains team still loses and Duncan and Courtney still swap teams, that's all fine. But here, Gwen doesn't dump Duncan and she doesn't try to make up with Courtney here. And also, Joe and Alejandro are able to convince the team that Heather is the biggest threat. And since all but Joe and Scott are first gen characters, they believe them. And so Heather gets eliminated, and Duncan actually goes to Boney Island this time due to not wanting to spend the night with the heroes, and because without Sierra, Cameron has no reason to volunteer. Episode 4 is also very similar, having the Scott New York start and the heroes lose, but instead of Sam leaving, it's Lashana, and Scott will go to Boney Island. This is also the start of the Mal arc, and Mal breaks Cameron's glasses here instead of next episode. In episode 5, Duncan starts to recognize Mal's wisdom. Courtney saves Gwen still, and instead of the heroes losing, it's the villains. And Joe gets voted out and sent to the heroes team due to the team swap, and Mal goes to Boney Island. In episode 6, Mal comes back from Boney Island, and Zoe and Cameron actually notice him acting strangely this time. Duncan gets closer to figuring out who Mal is, but Mal starts to mess with him, making him think he's no longer a tough guy. Gwen talks to Duncan and makes him feel better. Then Gwen and Courtney actually talk to each other. And it ends in an argument, but at least it's still progress. The challenge is the same, but on the trip there, when Chris says maybe someone will find the invincibility statue, it cuts to Scott in a confessional, revealing he found it back when he went there. The heroes team loses, and the newest member, Joe, convinces Courtney and Brick to vote for Cameron, due to how well he did in Merge last season. This results in a tiebreaker between Joe and Cameron, and Joe wins, sending Cameron home. Scott also goes back to Boney Island to make it seem like he hasn't found the idol yet. Episode 7 is also very similar, but it starts with Duncan's knife being ruined by Mal, and Duncan actually figures out who Mal is and confronts him in this episode. He doesn't say anything to Zoe yet, but in his conversation with Mal, Mal denies everything. The challenge is the same, and Courtney and Gwen fight. And this is where they finally make up, and after the challenge, they even talk to Duncan, but Courtney is still annoyed when she sees them both together. The heroes lose again, and Brick finally gets the chance to eliminate Joe. Scott goes to Boney Island and complains about how much he hates his plan now. Episode 8, The Merge. Everything happens basically the same here. Mal sabotages the boats, Gwen and Courtney work together here, but Gwen actually asks Duncan if he could back off just for the day so that her and Courtney can get closer. And Alejandro still wins. The difference here is that Mal antagonizes Duncan, resulting in him blowing up the cottage.
It was a mansion!
Fine, mansion. On Duncan's way out, he tells Zoe about what's going on, and when Chris asks about Boney Island again, Scott originally stays silent, but Courtney brings up the idol, and Scott goes again. Scott and Courtney also start dating after this episode's challenge, instead of starting in the next episode. Episode 9, the challenge stays semi the same, with Gwen winning immunity and sending Alejandro to Boney Island. But in this, Gwen spends the whole challenge with Courtney, and Scott ends up going along with Brick. And throughout the challenge, Zoe would notice how Mike was acting differently and remember what Duncan said to her, and so after the challenge, she talks to Chris privately and gets Mike pulled from the game for his mental well-being. But it doesn't end there, because Chris still wants an elimination, so he keeps going. And Gwen, Scott, Alejandro and Courtney vote out Brick, with the plan being from Courtney to take out Zoe's last ally. I need a double elimination at some point, and I think this would just be the best place for it. Episode 10, Scott starts getting jealous at how close Gwen and Courtney are getting, and the fact that at some points they even make fun of him together. I have Courtney winning this challenge, due to Zoe not being in the right headspace after all her allies being eliminated fairly recently. And it doesn't feel right giving Alejandro another immunity. But after the challenge, Scott and Courtney would get into an argument about Gwen, and Scott starting to think that she's only using him now. At the elimination, instead of Alejandro leaving, the votes are seemingly all going to Scott. But he uses the immunity idol and sends Gwen home with a single vote. This also means no Boney Island anymore, which is a relief for Scott. Episode 11, Sunday Muddy Sunday. God damn. This episode sucks, but thankfully with no Mal here, there's no chart, and thus no making Courtney the bad guy for the episode. Alejandro uses this challenge to get close to Zoe and give her her confidence back, expecting a strong ally in return. The challenge goes very similarly, with it being an ice cream challenge, but Courtney's ice cream doesn't get ruined, and her and Scott seem mainly focused on beating each other and not winning. But despite this, Scott wins immunity, and Alejandro and Courtney try to get Zoe on their side, but Zoe ultimately decides to side with Courtney and convinces Scott to eliminate Alejandro, using the fact that Courtney used to be into Alejandro against him. Episode 12. It's the final 3, and all that are left are Courtney, Zoe, and Scott. The challenge goes very similarly, but Courtney is actually able to snag the win here, and instead of getting rid of Scott, she plays it smart. She gets rid of Zoe because she's much more popular and physically fit than Scott. Episode 13. It's the finale. It's Gen 1 versus Gen 2. It's boy versus girl. It's ex-hero versus villain. And it's Courtney versus Scott. The challenge would be the same, but all the eliminated contestants would get to watch. And Chris would decide who would be helping them. And he decides to have Mike and Zoe help Scott due to their very rocky relationship in Revenge of the Island, and have Gwen and Duncan helping Courtney. Gwen and Courtney are still friends here, but Courtney and Duncan are still very far from friends. Mike is doing much better now that he was able to get help that he needed, but he and Zoe are still very hesitant to help out Scott. Throughout the challenge, both teams end up patching up their relationships, with Duncan apologising again and Courtney actually accepting it this time, and Scott apologising to Mike and Zoe and then both accepting it. In Scott's ending, it has him using Mike as a distraction for Chef as he runs past and grabs the sword. He does apologise after he wins, but Mike doesn't really care. After he wins, Courtney does what she does and comes on to him again, and it works and they get back together. In Courtney's ending, Scott tries to use Mike as a distraction still, but gets blasted, and Courtney easily gets the win. Scott acts goofy and Courtney finds it charming, and they get back together in this ending too, just under better circumstances. And yeah, that's my version of Total Drama All-Stars. I wouldn't have the island sink here because that was just random and dumb. But yeah, I hope you like what I did, and if you don't, then tell me what should have done differently. Anyway, see ya.